If you're a regular listener of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy, please rate and review us at the Apple Store using iTunes or the Podcasts app on your iPhone. And so I want to give a special thank you to Prairie Dog and Ghost Hornet, who both just gave us 5-star reviews. Prairie Dog writes, David Barkertley and his guests take us on a deep dive into topics related to science fiction and fantasy. The format varies between interviews where David talks to a creator, such as an author or other luminary of the field, and discussion groups where David and a panel of people discuss a topic or subject area. David is certainly one of the best prepared podcasters in the business, always ready with a fairly complete understanding of the topic or of the work of the interviewee. Geek's Guide is a treasure for the field of science fiction and fantasy, and has an extensive back catalog well worth exploring. So big thanks again to Prairie Dog and Ghost Hornet for their support. Alright, and so now let's get to our show.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here's your host, David Barkertley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 381 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Christopher Brown. His debut novel, Tropic of Kansas, was a finalist for the Campbell Award for Best Science Fiction Novel of 2018, and his short fiction appears in magazines such as MIT Technology Review, LitHub, Tor.com, and The Baffler. He also co-edited the anthology 3 Messages and a Warning, Contemporary Mexican Short Stories of the Fantastic. And we'll be speaking with him today about his new novel, Rule of Capture, about a defense attorney who represents political prisoners in a future America which is sliding toward fascism. And now here's our interview with Christopher Brown. All right, so we're here with Christopher Brown. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, David.
Okay, so how did you first get interested in science fiction?
Wow, I first got interested in science fiction, I suppose, as a kid growing up in the 70s as a sort of a child of the space age of, people flying to the moon and stuff like that. And I think I had the idea when I was really little that I would want to grow up and become an astronaut. And then there was, I grew up in the Midwest, and near my home growing up in this kind of funny old neighborhood, there was a kind of a used bookstore called The Time Machine. And it was run by a funny old guy who looked like an extra from one of those Three Musketeers movies, but wearing a kind of funny suit. He was like a theater professor at one of the local colleges and a Tolkien scholar. And he had this little used bookstore, and he would sell like tabletop role-playing games and vintage kind of science fiction hardbacks and paperbacks, all those like Bantam pulp reissues that they were doing back then, the Doc Savage books, stuff like that, a lot of adventure pulp, and new comics and old comics. And that's where I sort of started getting my early fixes or my early addictions, and kind of put me on the path to sort of ultimately becoming a science fiction writer as an adult.
That's a pretty amazing resource to have that there in your town, a store like that.
It was really cool. My friends and I had 2 friends that we kind of discovered it together. It was there's like this old railroad town. It's in Des Moines, and so the old like downtown of West Des Moines is where this was. And it was, you could either ride your bikes down the hill, or you could take the bus if you were an adventurous sort of 3rd or 4th grader. And so we would do both, and kind of hang out all Saturday afternoon, and probably drive the old guys crazy. But eventually they started let us playing their D&D games with us, and things would never be the same.
That's great. So you had friends who were also interested in all that stuff? You weren't a lonely geek?
Yeah, I mean, I had friends who we shared an interest, and then, things started to, I think, change come middle school. I got to middle school, and I was still a geek, and I was, like, going to middle school and bringing copies of, like, Starlog magazine and, like, showing it to people, like, they would think it was cool. And they all wanted to, go to the theatrical store across the street from the weird sci-fi bookstore and get, like, fake beards and go buy 6 packs of Pabst Blue Ribbon. And so we found a way to compromise between those 2 pursuits.
Does that work, getting a fake beard?
No, it didn't. No, if you're like a 14-year-old who looks like a 12-year-old wearing like some sort of badly botched, like rented beard or like crip hair from the theatrical store. I do remember the first time we tried that at like a gas station. The guy laughed so hard that he gave us our fake IDs back as just kind of credit for effort.
And so then did you, what sort of stuff were you really into? What sort of authors?
Well, I mean, I got really into kind of like in college is when I think I drifted away a little bit in high school. I wasn't really that focused on science fiction. And then I started to get really into J.G. Ballard in college and Walker Percy, who's thought of as more of a literary writer, but who wrote a lot of, he wrote a couple of books that were sort of nominally speculative fiction. And that sort of unique approach to science fiction that those authors presented was kind of what ultimately turned me on to trying to do something like that myself. And then also around that time was when Neuromancer came out, and that was kind of like my ticket back, or like my gateway drug back into sort of new science fiction at the time. And I just remember being really turned on by the stylistic innovation of that book and the way that it was sort of riffing on some of the other literary sources that I was excited about at the time, be they like, the Beats or even like Hunter S. Thompson and that kind of like gonzo nonfiction voice, or other journalistic writers like Joan Didion, where it's sort of like the sound of the words on the page was almost as important as what they were saying. And I got turned on to Burroughs at the time as well, and so that kind of mix of writers had a big kind of key formative influence.
And so were you sending stuff out to magazines, or?
No, I mean, I think like right as I got out of college. I mean, I was a journalist in college and right out of college. I was an editor of my school paper, and I worked as a stringer for Newsweek for a while. But then I was working in government, and I was doing a lot of like freelance writing of a very sort of kind of technical sort. I was writing like basically nonfiction works for like big NGOs like the World Bank and the UN, sort of the driest possible stuff to kind of make extra money. But I started playing around with writing fiction, and then I started sending stories out. I guess kind of like a few years out of college, and then went on to law school and to kind of pursue an interest in politics and government. But I went to law school in Iowa City, where the famous Writers' Workshop is, and still was a kind of around a lot of writing culture, and then all along as I was practicing law, I began writing and selling short stories and working on longer works that ultimately led me to the novels I'm writing now.
So in all that, were you connected to other science fiction writers or science fiction fandom or anything like that?
Yeah, it's a great question, David. I mean, initially, no. Like I talked about growing up in this town where there was sort of a community of people who had these interests. I didn't have any knowledge at all of like fandom or the existence of any of that. And when I first started writing short fiction and trying to figure out how to write a novel, there were I was not aware of the existence of science fiction workshops or conventions or anything like that. I might have been to a Star Trek convention or two, at some point along the way. And really, in a way, I didn't really think of what I was doing, of this work I was writing, as science fiction per se. I knew it had a kind of an element of the fantastic, but I didn't know if I was trying to be Borges or J.G. Ballard or, a literary writer. I wasn't thinking about it so much in those generic terms.
So
But
the magazines that you were sending work to were not science fiction magazines?
they were more like cool literary zines, right? My first sale was to, there was a really nice kind of small literary magazine, kind of quasi-zine out of Seattle called Paper Radio, and they published this my first story, like in the late 90s, and that was sort of typical of that. And then, but not long after that, I moved to Austin. And in Austin, part of the reason I moved here is at the time my family and I were looking for a new place to live. We had moved back to the Midwest and were ready for something different. And I kind of came here for like a work conference for a weekend. And I was like, and I saw that there was a science fiction bookstore here that the community could sustain. And I knew that writers like Bruce Sterling lived here, and that this had been kind of the, as much as any place, the birthplace of cyberpunk, the science fiction genre that had really turned me on as a 20-something. And so I almost partly moved here because I knew there was something like that here. And I met a number of writers here, including Don Webb and ultimately Bruce and Jessica Reisman and others. And that really was my gateway to the kind of wider community of science fiction writers and readers who sort of participate actively in fandom. And I got involved with the Turkey City Writers Workshop, which has been going on here since the 70s. Run by a series of writers, and at the time it was run by Bruce Sterling, and so I got invited to participate in that. And the way he was doing is he would do it every 2 or 3 months, and he would bring in a prominent writer or sometimes editor from out of town to participate, and everybody would bring a story. You would do this really intense day-long workshop, kind of Milford style round table, and that went on actively for sort of 4 or 5 years before Bruce moved on, and we still have it here. But I learned a tremendous amount from doing that, and really kind of credit that with sort of coming to understand really the kind of the inner workings of the science fiction narrative.
So what exactly was that process that takes you from moving to town and not knowing anyone to being in this writing group with Bruce Sterling?
You reach out for like writing community through a variety of sources. There's a group here in Austin called the Writers League of Texas. It's a nonprofit that puts on classes for people, for writers, whether they're people trying to take their first stab at writing a work of fiction or nonfiction, or people who are pretty well established and trying to, kind of develop their skill set in some particular way. And so that's basically what I did. I mean, I was a busy young lawyer working a job and raising a family, but I also had time I took a class. I think I took a novel in progress class. I had a book I was working on at the time, and I took a class with Don Webb, who is a brilliant primarily short story writer based here in Austin, and a tremendously gifted teacher. And so I met Don. Through Don, I met some other writers here, like Jessica Reisman, who I mentioned, and Lawrence Person, who is a kind of a long-standing science fiction, kind of hard science fiction short story writer here. And then met Bruce and Howard Waldrop, and a wide array of other folks here. I mean, we have a pretty rich community of science fiction and fantasy writers here, and a pretty active one. And I guess I've been immersed in that for close to 20 years now, and it's a wonderful thing to have in your town, and to go from like having 20 plus years of not even knowing that kind of community existed to having it be such a rich part of your life is a pretty joyous thing in a way, and very beneficial.
And so that novel in progress, was that Tropic of Kansas, or? No,
I wrote a kind of a technology business novel, like an early thriller, and it was pretty good, but it was very topical, and I think I don't think I really fully finished it. And I had one other sort of trunk novel I worked on before some of life's interruptions, and then Tropic of Kansas, which I started working on, probably 7 years ago, and came out, of course, 2 years ago.
So how did that happen that you started working on that particular novel?
Tropic of Kansas was, initially, I've always written a pretty politically engaged science fiction. I'm very interested. I have this background in politics and government as well, and I worked on Capitol Hill for a long time. I was a staff lawyer on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and I was like one of those C-SPAN guys you'd see, but I was like sitting back there when I was supposed to be taking notes, like, jotting down, working on my stories. And so I had been working a lot. I had written a lot of, kind of near future or even kind of altered present, science fiction stories with a heavy political component. And so Tropic of Kansas initially started out to be something like that, and it was basically like the idea of imagining, at the time I was starting to work on it, is when the Arab Spring was happening and Occupy was happening. There was like an Occupy staging base, like right across in an old neon plant right across the street from where we live in a kind of industrial neighborhood of East Austin. And I just sort of got to wondering, like imagining, what would happen if you had like an American Spring, if these revolutions we see going on the other side of the world were happening right here, if, Occupy with AK-47s, if you will. So that was kind of the basic counterfactual premise. And I had been playing around. I had written a story for an anthology that was edited by Joe Lansdale, our great kind of East Texas master of Texas weird and sort of bayou noir, and another writer named Scott Cuff. They did an anthology for the centennial of Robert E. Howard, another Texas writer, for his the centennial of his birth. And so I had written a story for that sort of played on those like Robert E. Howard adventure pulp archetypes, and trying to repurpose them towards more emancipatory ends, if you will, with a little bit more political bite and maybe a little bit more like, character-driven literary ambition, if you will. And so I wanted to repurpose that kind of pulp material and write something that, riffed on those sorts of adventure fiction precedents. It evolved into something kind of much more than that in a way, maybe trying to be a little bit more Cormac McCarthy than Robert E. Howard, as it were, and it ended up taking on a much more green sort of cli-fi kind of thematic emphasis than I really expected when I set out. Because sort of as I was writing at the characters, and I'm sort of trying to write this sort of character-driven science fiction, the characters came to realize that these like social and economic and political injustices they were fighting in their society were really ultimately rooted in the damaged relationship that society had with the land on which the people lived, and which of course is just also my bringing to bear my own observations of what was going on in the world around me and my own interest, sort of independently from my writing in urban ecology and kind of urban environmental activism, and so that ended up turning it into a kind of green revolutionary story that's a trajectory that's carrying through the novel that came out just earlier this fall, Rule of Capture, and the one I'm working on now.
So what was the process like of getting that first novel published? Was it hard? Was it?
It's really funny, yeah, so David, I finished that, and I don't know, I'm a really good self-critic in some respects, I think, and so I was like, oh, this is so implausible, because among the other premises of Tropic of Kansas were that there's a charismatic CEO who has become a fascist president. And when I finished that in like November of 2014, I remember it was like, because I remember I finished it right before going on like Thanksgiving break. I finished it and I kind of let it sit, and then I picked it back up and I got ready to send it out, and then I was just like kind of sat on it for a while because I was like, oh, nobody's ever gonna believe that. That's so implausible. Really, I was sort of so I kind of sat on it for a while, and then I started trying to get friends to help me. I thought maybe the best way to get an agent would be through referrals from friends, and I tried that a little bit with some success, and basically, I had one friend who was an editor at Tor, and he said, well, send it to me, and I'll help you find an agent. So I sent it to him, and he was kind of sitting on it. And I was just like, well, now the news is like catching up with me, and I've gone from thinking this book is too implausible to saying this book is, the headlines are catching up with it, and I need to get it out there. So I just did it the old-fashioned way and did some research looking for kind of young and hungry agents who were looking for, quote unquote, upmarket science fiction, and started cold querying. And
upmarket science fiction meaning sort of more literary sophistication.
Yeah, I guess that's their term. I mean, it was a term I saw. It was like an agent's term, and it meant like, science fiction that people who are not necessarily entirely immersed in the genre would find readable, I guess. Yeah, or maybe it means science fiction with a certain literary ambition. But I don't know. I think most science fiction has its own literary ambitions. But I think this is a book. It's set in basically a slightly altered present. And style does matter in the book. The voice of the book matters a lot. And so that seemed a good fit. And I had a lot of luck with just that kind of cold querying, and the editor who had said he was going to, hook me up with an agent ultimately was the first one who bought it. And then 6 days after he bought it, he died, and we had to, go, and we ended up back with one of the other publishers that had bid on the book. So, and to my great fortune, the book ended up at Harper Voyager with David Pomerico and his team, where I've found a really good home for the kind of work I'm trying to do, and part of what's a really interesting and diverse list of writers that I'm happy to be part of, including some good friends, including even a couple of folks from Austin, Nikki Drayden and C. Robert Cargill.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the book did really well. I mean, I remember hearing about it when it came out, which is, not necessarily automatic for a first novel like that. I mean, did you have the perception like, oh, this is going really well, this book is really being well received?
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard to tell. But I certainly was very fortunate to get some pretty good review coverage when it came out. And I think I did have the good fortune of kind of hitting the zeitgeist pretty well in terms of having tapped into some sort of maybe not unevenly distributed futures, more like unevenly distributed presence. And I got pretty good reader response from it, and I put a lot of energy into trying to get the word out. And so, I feel very fortunate that it seems to have found a readership, and to have some people connect with what I was trying to do.
When you say that you put a lot of energy into getting the word out, what kind of stuff did you do?
I find that one of the most enjoyable things for me to do in terms of promoting a new work of fiction is to write a lot of related nonfiction. Science fiction, part of the reason I'm so attracted to it is it's the, self-proclaimed literature of ideas. It's a form of storytelling that's not afraid to pack some big ideas into the stories and to turn those ideas and to talk about those ideas through story. But nonfiction can also be a fun way to talk about some of those ideas. So like with Tropic of Kansas, I tapped into a lot of the different things I was playing with there, including some of the kind of real world experiences I had had, like, traveling through the war zones of Central America in the 80s when I was really too young to even be doing that kind of activity, and how I kind of imported that over to into my made up third world in America and stuff like that. And so I ended up doing just similar things with the new book, Rule of Capture, writing about some of the things about, which is more of a lawyer story, and so kind of riffing on some of the things around research I did into lawyer stories and law and lawyers and science fiction and things like that.
Well, yeah, so let's talk about Rule of Capture. So just talk a little bit about the world building that you did. We're in the United States, and the United States has lost a war to China, and things are all kind of crumbling.
Yeah, I mean, Rule of Capture is it's nominally based in sort of the same world as Tropic of Kansas, but really a very different kind of voice and story, and set essentially earlier in time, and quite deliberately works as an independent story. And so the world of Rule of Capture, it's in America that's kind of going through its own like Weimar Republic moment, if you will. It's in America that is ravaged by climate change. The Midwest is sort of wrecked by drought and just kind of generalized ecological and economic exhaustion. There's sort of a lot of internal refugees, kind of people trying to leave the Midwest to find more hospitable climes. And the U.S. has lost a war with China. Not a super, not a long drawn out war, a pretty quick conflict that's mostly been orbital, but one that has resulted in the humiliation of a country that previously was basically a kind of dominant imperial power, and is sort of subjected to treaty accords and austerity programs and things like that. The kind of circumstance that both opens up the window of the politically possible, but also provides a fertile ground for the ferment of kind of ultranationalism. And so that's kind of the root of the divisive political conflict going on. And there are people who kind of want to grab the country back. And so, the idea is that in many respects it sort of feels like, say, Germany in the late 20s or early 30s did during the Weimar years, or kind of like Chile and Argentina were right before the outbreaks of their respective dirty wars, something that I have some experience with through family. And so into this world, we introduce a series of characters who are kind of caught up in some of the struggles that situation has created.
Right. I think it's so interesting what you're doing here. Once I got into the book and started realizing it, is that we're so used to seeing dystopian fiction as, basically the dystopia has been realized and nobody has any rights anymore and it's completely totalitarian. But this is sort of, it's in process, and democracy and rights are slipping away, but they're still there. And so you have your main character as this criminal defense attorney defending more sort of political prisoners. And so it's not hopeless at this point. He can still reach for these levers of power and try to wield them while they still are effective.
Yeah, I mean, it's a world, it's exactly, David. It's not sort of absolute dystopia. It's kind of incipient dystopia, maybe. And it's trying to grapple with, the ways in which, like in my own lifetime, I've witnessed, as a lawyer, as somebody working in politics, and just as a citizen, seeing how my own belief and the sort of norms I've been raised with regarding the rule of law can be very rapidly eroded, often through the capitulation of lawyers, the lawyers we rely on to kind of hold the line. This rule of capture is informed by the experience of seeing, reading the memos that were written by lawyers to sort of explain away the legal prohibitions on torture, and a lot of other things like that. Not just in the kind of extremes of national security law, but also in kind of everyday business law and technology and things like that, and in people's public conduct, which we all witness in our daily news feed. And so trying to look at a world in which, there aren't really, actual evil is sort of emerging in the society, but mostly through the bad judgment of sometimes well-intentioned people, or certainly people who, by and large, are motivated by what they think are, higher values, and just taking a realistic look at, the ways in which in our society often people who are kind of trapped by the criminal justice system are guilty of what they're charged with, but the things that they're charged with, the crimes they're charged with committing, are things that, in the grand schemes of things, aren't really that criminal, and that there are a lot of inequities built into the system, and that the dystopia is already there, depending on the angle from which you look at it.
Well, just to do this, to combine a legal thriller with this sort of proto-dystopian world, seems like such a great idea, just as an elevator pitch, but I don't remember ever seeing another book like this. Did you just come up with this idea and instantly think, oh, this is great, I've really got something here, or did the implications of it unfold?
I came up with it originally, David, while I was working on Tropic of Kansas, and I was like, I had Tropic of Kansas, as I was saying, is kind of an adventure novel. It's like a road novel, and it's these, there's it's sort of centered around these people on the run across this, the kind of wasted out Midwest of the title. And I had a scene where one of the characters that was in jail had gotten locked up in jail by the dystopian authorities, and his buddy wanted to get him out. And I'd already sort of exhausted the readers, the number of plausible escapes that you can have in one book. And I was sort of in the middle of the book, and the part where you're, I was kind of working through this, and I went to on a coffee break, and I was like standing there getting in my car with my coffee by the side of the highway, and I look up and there's this billboard, here in Texas, where lawyer ads flourish like prickly pear. And by the side of the road, the ad is for, it's a very Austin sort of lawyer marketing. It's the lawyer who rocks. So, if you're the sort of person who wants your lawyer to also be in a band. And I was like looking at that guy, and he's got like a coat and tie and a biker jacket. I was just like, oh, that's interesting. And who are the lawyers in dystopia? How would lawyers adapt to, a kind of degeneration of the rule of law? What would criminal lawyers do if, habeas corpus were suspended? The basic right not to be unlawfully detained, which is a power that the federal government has right there in the Constitution in times of insurrection or rebellion or other emergency. So I created this character for that book. He didn't end up surviving the ultimate revisions, but he's there. He gets a phone call, and he helps get a character out. And I love that idea, though. That I was really interested in this idea, and I'm interested in the tradition of political lawyers and kind of radical lawyers like William Kunstler, the guy who was famous for defending the Chicago 7, and there's this fascinating French lawyer named Jacques Verger, who was of an Algerian background, and he had represented the supposed terrorists during the Algiers War, and then went on to defend alleged terrorists and war criminals. And so I wanted to kind of play with that idea in a dystopian context. And so I pitched my editor to that idea. We were having lunch one day at WorldCon and kind of talking about what's next after Tropic of Kansas. And I said, yeah, and I have this idea. It's kind of like Better Call Saul meets 1984, haha. And he's listening, and you could just see it on his face, and he liked it enough he wanted to. So, and it's a fun thing for me, because as you suggest, there really isn't anything out there like that. There's there's a lot of law in science fiction, from Asimov's laws of robotics to the Prime Directive, the laws that the animal-human hybrids have to follow in the island of Dr. Moreau. There's a lot of law, but very few lawyers. I have, my theories on why that is, among other things, because I think, to imagine the lawyers of the future, you need to imagine what justice looks like in the future, really what the society, you have to imagine something very radically different from what we have now. But anyway, it's I think really, it's kind of fresh territory to mine. It's also tricky territory because I had never really been that conversant in the material of lawyer stories, and had to kind of do a deep dive on that. And they follow very different rules from kind of normal fiction writing. And so kind of figuring out how to do this kind of mashup and make it all sync up, right, was a very interesting, challenging, and ultimately rewarding exercise.
So did you ever send an email to the lawyer who rocks thanking him for inspiring your book?
I have not. I've gotten the message to him through friends. I have some friends who have cases with him. I should probably just invite the guy to lunch sometime. I just learned that he used to party at the house 3 doors down from me with some prior owners of one of the houses on my street. So we're kind of 1 degree removed. And he's not the only lawyer who inspired it, but there are, but yeah, he was, he made an imprint for sure.
So your mutual friends, these are other lawyers or defendants? Other
lawyers, yeah. I mean, I'm still a practicing lawyer, and so I have a lot of friends who do, that guy's a trial lawyer. So a lot of friends who are trial lawyers, and it's a finite community of people who practice in the county courts here, and so yeah. I have a friend who just read my book, Red Will of Capture, and she's like, "Oh, I have a case with that guy. I'm so funny." So, because she had heard me tell that story at my book launch here at Book People here in Austin.
Yeah. So when your agent wanted 2 books, were you just super excited, or were there any challenges or misgivings or anything?
Well, yeah. I mean, it was my editor who was interested in 2 books, I mean, I was excited. I mean, I'm much, trying to make a real impact as a novelist, it's very important to try to kind of meet the market with a reasonable amount of material. And so the idea of getting to being able to, just to be able to write novels on spec, on contract, to make a pitch and then, know that you have a home for the book, assuming you don't totally blow it in the execution, right? That's tremendously rewarding, and it's a great way to build a relationship with your editor and publisher. And it's a great way to keep on schedule, because there's no better deadline than, one that's in a contract with a giant international corporation with, an army of lawyers ready to come breathing down your neck if you fail to meet your commitments. And not that it's like that, but I mean, just having that kind of hard obligation is very helpful. It's a little scary to crank out 2 books in basically 2 years. I mean, I took, almost 3 years really, to write Tropic of Kansas, and I did some very deep kind of comprehensive rewrites, a couple of them, and almost wrote 2.5 books to get the one, as it were. And so it's a very different experience. But when you're trying to write, on the one hand, I'm trying to write character-driven works of speculative fiction, rich with world building, but I also want to write propulsive and entertaining books. And so having those kinds of deadlines, especially when the protagonist is a deadline-driven lawyer, that's something that ultimately, while it's terrifying, you can use it to charge the material in a way that I think works.
I heard you say that the book after Rule of Capture is going to be more of a utopian approach, or?
Yeah, the book I'm working on now, the working title is Failed State, and it's a follow-on, and it's basically with the same character from Rule of Capture, but taking place after the events of Tropic of Kansas, after there's been an uprising in the United States, and the federal government is kind of in shambles, and nothing's really working, and so whereas in Rule of Capture, the protagonist is basically this burned-out criminal defense lawyer who is representing people in a kind of domestic Guantanamo court, people who are basically politically rowdy young people who are getting kind of hauled in front of a secret tribunal to just shut them down, in an America drifting into authoritarianism. In the new book, the lawyer is defending people who are being hauled in front of post-revolutionary justice tribunals, kind of like truth and reconciliation tribunals with a heavy sort of environmental component or ecological component. And there's a lot of that. There's a lot of talk of that, at least in certain circles in science fiction, about using speculative fiction to give us the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions we never seem to get in real life. But so, yeah, playing with that kind of material and playing with the idea of justice and of just trying to write. All three of these books, Tropic of Kansas and Rule of Capture, they're very dark. They go to very dark places, but they're doing it for positive purposes to try to, partly to use that speculative counterfactual as a vehicle to kind of maybe dial up the focus on some of the darker aspects of the world around us in order to try to find paths to the better future that could lie on the other side, trying to find my way to, a more hopeful setting. But writing utopias has its own challenges because utopia, it's kind of like the old Talking Heads song, Heaven, and heaven is a place where nothing ever happens. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, if you create a society without conflict, it's more like landscape writing or something, or nature writing, which isn't a bad thing, but it's not a thriller. But I figure, all you have to do to make utopia have a little conflict in utopia is drop a lawyer into it.
When you talk about the future of justice, one idea I've seen in some science fiction novels is that judges and juries should just be replaced by super intelligent AIs who should make all the decisions. Is that something that you've thought about at all?
Yeah, like in Rule of Capture, part of the backstory, it's sort of in the margins, but the idea is that there's this very prosperous China that's basically like an AI-based government. Like people, basically, the Chinese have figured out how to operate a successful, centrally planned socialist economy with a really sophisticated AI that's kind of, really running the show. And there's a similar idea. These two very interesting writers, Ingrid Burrington and Brendan Byrne, had a really cool project they did earlier this year, speculative fiction project that was sponsored by Mozilla, called The Training Commission. That's very similar in a way to some of the stuff I'm doing. But it's like delivered in this very innovative narrative form, in like the form of a series of emails from the future. But that's set in an America in which there's been a kind of a second civil war, and people like do-gooding NGOs and nonprofit types have kind of decided to come up with like an AI-based system to ensure justice, but it ends up with all of these disappointing results in the way that our own, utopian aspirations for the internet often produce very disappointing kind of surveillance capitalist results. But in my own work, I don't know, I've become less and less interested in kind of the technological futures. I mean, I think so many smart writers are exploring those things, and I'm like, in these books, I'm a lot of what I'm doing is mining the past to kind of imagine my future. Rule of Capture kind of like taps into some of the like deep roots of property law and land law, and kind of looking at how our, most land ownership is ultimately rooted in some form of theft because it's ultimately based on conquest. So I'm kind of going in that counterintuitive direction. I think a lot of science fiction tends to be sort of ahistorical, and for me, I find really rich material in trying to take some of that stuff and then extrapolate forward from the deep past.
Ahistorical in the sense of just being disconnected from real history?
Yeah, just being so excited about the future, right? Which is not a bad thing. I don't mean it as like some sort of objective criticism. But I just think, it's often, future-focused science fiction is often pretty completely unmoored from real history, as it were. Or just kind of so completely focused on the technophilia of the world building, of the kind of the forward-looking world building that I don't know. I think that there's an opportunity there, especially if you want to write something that's got kind of that's imbued with a sense of realism, to kind of draw from real material. I mean, like with Rule of Capture, right? I wanted to write this sort of crazy dystopia of like an America under martial law, with like secret courts and people being rounded up without due process, and all I had to do was like go to the law library and research precedents in our own history in which those kinds of things had happened. Like there's like a whole shelf of books in the back of the University of Texas Law Library on the practical administration of martial law and topics like that from a period in our history when it was pretty common for like governors to use martial law to suppress labor actions and stuff like that. Or even, just looking back at some of the things that have happened in this country since 9/11.
In Rule of Capture, we hear a little bit about the better regime that preceded the totalitarian-leaning regime, and the main character thinks it was a different town back then, free and still full of possibility, locus of a rare historical moment when politics was infused with the same imagination as the arts, and the so-called politicians were practicing a utopian experiment in applied science fiction.
Yeah.
I was just curious if you could say more about that. Do you see a role for science fiction in government or imagination and things like that? Is that what you would promote yourself?
Totally. That's a great question, David. And thanks for bringing that up. I mean, I think that the science fictional imagination, or maybe we could call it the utopian imagination, plays a really important role in political theory. And as we were sort of talking about at the outset of my background, I come to science fiction from a background in politics and political theory, and kind of thinking about what would a better society look like. I mean, like Tropic of Kansas is sort of asking the question, like, did history end at 1789? Maybe we should, is this existing constitutional regime, surely there's that's not the end of history, right? There's some place to evolve beyond that. And if you look at, in my opinion, if you look at, Western, at least political thought, going back to the Enlightenment, there's this constant conversation between kind of two extremes. And on the one hand is sort of pragmatic conservatism that sort of, the world is the way it is because that's how it is, that's how it's naturally evolved. And people who look and say, well, no, there are ways we can redesign society to make it better, to make people happier, to achieve greater social welfare, and to eliminate conflict, and to achieve greater degrees of equality. And, some of those theories are pretty wacky, like this, French theorist Fourier, who had on the one hand, he had this design for these little communities that were even implemented in the 19th century U.S. in places like Ohio. But he also, imagined a world in which there were like seas made of lemonade and like giant whales flying in the sky. But, more practically, you have, things like, the kind of communist and socialist theories of Marx and the like that kind of were such a heavy weight in the discourse, all through the past 200 years. And then, with the, the collapse of the Soviet Union, that kind of utopian thinking, I think, kind of disappeared from our political discourse. And you just now have kind of like, degrees of pragmatic thought guiding our ideas, but no, like aspirations for that kind of happier world that could lie on the other side. Utopia is not a real place, but it's one you can kind of imagine from here. And I think science fiction plays a really can, if it wishes, play a really important role in trying to imagine those more hopeful futures and sort of reigniting that important project of trying to imagine how we can get to a better world, especially in an environment now where I think, especially with the sort of the looming sense of doom that surrounds the way people talk about the climate. I think that science fiction can do a really useful thing in terms of imagining futures in which, we've at least partly solved those sorts of problems and managed to find a way to live in balance with nature in a way that's healthy and that still affords a reasonably enjoyable life.
There was sort of this thread in the book that seemed to suggest that we should not be extending our current system of private real estate out into space to the moon and Mars. Do you have some other system in mind instead?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, there's a whole other interesting body of law that really exists. This so-called space law that explores some of these issues, who owns the moon, and can you turn the moon into your private property? And in the world of rule of capture, the idea is that people are taking our private property regimes from here into space. And in the real world, I mean, the idea is under the treaties that were established during the space race in the 60s that the things beyond Earth's orbit are there for, quote unquote, for all mankind or for all humankind, that it's the commons. And I think, I mean, to me, I don't know that I have the absolute system for figuring out how that should be done, but I think there's an emerging system already happening, and that getting back to that idea of there being the commons of kind of commonly shared property is kind of the core property premise, and specific exclusive private rights being the exception. I mean, I think we see how much conflict and inequality arises out of the property regimes we have in place now here on this planet. And I guess as I look at things like, some of the recent, like in 2015-16, the U.S. adopted new laws to try to start exporting private property laws into space, and the nation of Luxembourg is trying to become like the Delaware of space, where it's like the place you go that has the most favorable corporate laws for commercializing space. And well, on the one hand, I suppose the profit motive may be an effective way to get people to throw private money at space exploration, which seems to be working to some extent. I'm pretty skeptical about the idea of that, say, private ownership of Mars would be a good thing. I don't really see that. And I'm more interested in sort of seeing something like what, Kim Stanley Robinson envisions in his Mars trilogy, where people come up with which has a kind of legal fiction component to it. It's people negotiate a new constitution for the planet Mars, which includes rights of the ecosystem itself. And I think if you have there's a place for private property rights, but I don't think that it's the exclusive basis of not a healthy exclusive basis for trying to develop a balanced relationship with the environment here or in space.
Yeah. All right, so we're running out of time. I did want to, we were talking off air that I just moved to Austin, and I wanted to ask you, I guess, a little bit more. Is there anything else that, science fiction fans who come to Austin should know about the local writing scene here?
Yeah, well, I mean, Austin is home to just a wide array of really great science fiction writers. I talked about Don Webb and Howard Waldrop and Nikki Drade, and there's also Martha Wells is based in College Station near here. Stina Leicht, Marshall Ryan Maresca, Robert Jackson Bennett, Eugene Fisher, Amanda Downham. There's Fernando Flores, who wrote this great kind of FSG dystopia this year, Tears of the Truffle Pig. And so there's a great community here, and we have every year, usually in August, we have a really tremendous literary science fiction convention called Armadillo Con that's been going on for 40 plus years. And we've taken the Turkey City Writers Workshop and made it into a nonprofit that's now with the group of us as its kind of board and instructors. We're trying to provide a really great annual workshop for kind of emerging writers of science fiction and fantasy, and one that really works hard to provide a home for diverse voices. We have sponsored seats for writers from underrepresented groups that includes like free attendance at the workshop and at the convention, and so we're really keen to have more people come down here and get to know the community through that.
I mean, you were talking about when you were younger that there was this science fiction bookstore that you went to. Is there anything like that in Austin these days?
I mean, we still have a great community of independent bookstores that there's not an exclusively science fiction bookstore, but we have Book People, which is just a tremendous, long-standing independent bookstore that's a great home for the fantastic literary genres. We have a store called Malvern Books that specializes in, kind of small press literary fiction, including a lot of science fiction and fantasy presses, as well as poetry and literature and translation. And they put on all kinds of events and are, again, a wonderful home for writers of the genre. There's a shop called Bookwoman that's focused on feminist literature, fiction and nonfiction, and a bunch of other stores. And even the big chains that are here are, do put on lots of signings for both established and, more indie sorts of writers. And so we're very fortunate in that regard. And there are a lot of other kind of smaller workshops here. We have Turkey City, which continues on as a workshop for kind of an invitation-based workshop for working professional writers. Slug Tribe, which is kind of in between and meets like monthly. And it's a great community for people who are trying to hone their craft as writers of fantastic fiction.
Right now, I was telling you I just moved to Austin a couple of weeks ago, so I'm definitely looking forward. I haven't had a chance really to check out any of that stuff, but I'm definitely looking forward to it.
Well, we're really excited to have you here, and it's going to be fun.
Yeah, I appreciate that. You mentioned earlier that Robert E. Howard was from Texas. I know he was from a place called Cross Plains, Texas. I was just curious if you've ever been there, or is it...
I've been up there, and every summer they have these like Robert E. Howard days. I've never been to that. There's a writer named Mark Finn who now lives out of up near Wichita Falls, close to Larry McMurtry's town in Archer City. But he's very active in that scene. But it's Cross Plains is sort of like halfway between Austin and the Panhandle, and but I think he's an interesting precedent and a useful one. I mean, a lot of things, you go back and read those stories now, there's a lot of material that's pretty problematic that I wasn't as clued into, when I picked up my first, copy of Conan stories, as a middle schooler or whatever. But he does something that I think is really useful, which is when you read those stories, you can just see how you read them from today's perspective. And you can see how he was, they're filled with the characters of real life. I mean, they're filled especially the secondary characters and so on. It's all like he's drawing from the real life of this boomtown of kind of turn of the century Texas, when, at a time when the sort of what we think of the Old West, wasn't any more distant to them than like the 80s is to us, right? And that thing of trying to draw from the material of real life to inform your adventurous or fantastic stories that may be kind of adding layers of the imaginative to the material you see in the world around you. I think that's I think it's a worthy undertaking, especially if you can also try to work hard to see that world that you're drawing from through the eyes of others and from others who might have a different experience of that world, which is something that I'm not sure stories of that vintage did as well as they might have.
Yeah. So, I mean, I gather that he didn't like cross planes very much, and that's part of why he wanted to imagine being somewhere else. But I think it would be interesting to see it.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up, I'm a Midwestern kid. I grew up in a pretty, what to my experience was kind of leave it to beaver reality, and it was both very pleasant and sort of very boring. And I think, those kinds of, pretty growing up in sort of boring places is is a fertile ground for the science fictional or the fantastic imagination. And I remember seeing there was this very, I thought at the time, very good movie adaptation. This movie about Robert E. Howard's life, starring Vincent D'Onofrio as Howard and Renee Zellweger, I think in her first role as this teacher that was a good friend of his and maybe paramour. And it showed that thing of that very mode of imaginative expression where you kind of look at the world around you and you describe it, but then you layer it over with a kind of imaginative flourish that makes, in a way, the things more interesting than they are. Kind of the opposite of a minimalism that sort of strips them down to their bare essence, right? And I found a lot of sympathy with that. I was like, yeah, that's kind of, I can relate to that. And I think a lot of us do that in our science fiction and fantasy works, and I don't think it's a bad thing.
Yeah, I really like that movie. It's called The Whole Wide World.
Yep.
I would definitely recommend it.
Yeah.
All right, so yeah, we're pretty much out of time, so I think we'll wrap things up there. Do you have any other, Chris, any other final thoughts or anything else you want to let people know about?
No, I think I just, like I said, I'd love to see more folks coming down to Armadillo Con, and I'm delighted to have so many people seeming to enjoy Rule of Capture, and I'm looking forward to being back at it next summer with this new utopian novel, Failed State.
All right, great. Yeah, definitely looking forward to that, and everyone definitely check out Rule of Capture by our guest today, Christopher Brown. So, Chris, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, David.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Christopher Brown for joining us on the show. And remember that Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoyed the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.